In 1492, after years of rejection from various European courts, Christopher Columbus finally secured the support of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. The monarchs had just completed the Reconquista by defeating the Moors in Granada, and they were eager to expand Spanish influence beyond Europe. Columbus promised to find a new westward route to Asia, which could bring Spain wealth through trade and potential territorial expansion. Despite skepticism from some advisors, Isabella agreed to finance the voyage, providing Columbus with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The agreement, known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe, granted Columbus the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any lands he discovered, along with a share of the profits. This royal backing marked the beginning of Spain's overseas empire and set the stage for European exploration and colonization of the Americas. On August 3, 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera in southern Spain, beginning his historic voyage across the Atlantic. He commanded a fleet of 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The crew consisted of about 90 men, many of whom were skeptical about the journey, fearing they would never return. Despite these concerns, Columbus remained confident in his belief that sailing west would lead to Asia. The fleet first stopped at the Canary Islands for repairs and supplies, where they remained for nearly a month before resuming their voyage on September 6th. As they ventured into the uncharted waters of the Atlantic, tensions grew among the crew, but Columbus reassured them by adjusting the recorded distances to make the journey seem shorter. His persistence and leadership kept the expedition moving forward, leading to the eventual sighting of land in October. In the early hours of October 12, 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, Christopher Columbus and his crew finally spotted land. A sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, aboard the Pinta, was the first to see it. The fleet had arrived at an island in the present-day Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. Stepping ashore, Columbus, dressed in his finest attire and carrying the Spanish flag, formally claimed the land for Spain. He was met by the indigenous Taino people, whom he mistakenly referred to as Indians, believing he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. The Taino were welcoming, offering gifts and assistance, but Columbus quickly noted their lack of advanced weaponry and gold, which fueled his ambitions of further exploration and conquest. This moment marked the beginning of European expansion into the Americas, setting off a chain of events that would alter the course of history for both the indigenous peoples and European powers. After landing on San Salvador, Christopher Columbus continued exploring the Caribbean, seeking gold, valuable resources, and a route to Asia. He sailed to other islands, including present-day Cuba, which he believed might be the mainland of China, and Hispaniola, where he encountered larger indigenous communities. The local Taino people initially welcomed Columbus and his crew, offering food, cotton, and small amounts of gold. Columbus took this as a sign that larger quantities of gold existed nearby, fueling his determination to claim more land for Spain. During his time in the region, he noted the island's fertile lands and strategic locations, envisioning them as future Spanish colonies. His interactions with the Taino varied, with initial exchanges of gifts and goodwill gradually giving way to growing tensions. As Columbus and his men asserted control, they began demanding resources and labor from the indigenous people, marking the beginning of European exploitation in the Americas. His exploration of the Caribbean not only opened the door for future Spanish conquest, but also laid the foundation for the transatlantic exchange of goods, cultures, and ultimately, conflict between Europeans and native populations. In December 1492, during his exploration of Hispaniola, Christopher Columbus faced an unexpected challenge when his flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground on a reef. With no way to salvage the vessel, he ordered his men to dismantle it and use the wood to construct a small settlement. This became La Navidad, the first European colony in the Americas. Columbus, believing he had found the outskirts of Asia, decided to leave 39 men behind to maintain Spanish presence and search for gold while he returned to Spain. The Taino people, led by a local chief named Guacanagari, initially welcomed the settlers, offering them food and shelter. However, Columbus's departure marked the beginning of tensions, as the Spanish settlers soon clashed with the indigenous people. When Columbus returned on his second voyage in 1493, he found La Navidad completely destroyed, with all of his men killed. The exact cause remains unclear, but accounts suggest that the Spaniards' mistreatment of the Taino, their demands for gold, and conflicts with rival indigenous groups contributed to their demise. The failure of La Navidad foreshadowed the violent struggles that would define European colonization in the New World. In March 1493, after months of exploring the Caribbean, Christopher Columbus set sail back to Spain to report his discoveries. He departed from Hispaniola with the Niña and the Pinta, as the Santa Maria had been lost earlier. The return journey proved difficult, with storms battering the ships and nearly causing them to sink. At one point, fearing for his life, Columbus wrote a brief account of his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it into the ocean, hoping it would reach Spain, even if he did not survive. After weeks at sea, Columbus landed in Portugal, where he was briefly detained before being allowed to continue to Spain. Upon his arrival in Barcelona, he was received as a hero by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He presented exotic goods, gold trinkets, and indigenous captives as proof of his success. The Spanish court, eager to capitalize on his discoveries, granted him further support for another voyage. Columbus remained convinced that he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, unaware that he had set the stage for European colonization of an entirely new continent. In September 1493, Christopher Columbus embarked on his second voyage to the New World, this time with a much larger fleet of 17 ships and around 1,200 men, including settlers, priests, and soldiers. The goal was not just exploration, but also colonization and resource exploitation. Upon arriving at Hispaniola, Columbus discovered that La Navidad, the settlement he had left behind, had been completely destroyed, with all his men killed, likely due to conflicts with the indigenous Taino people. Undeterred, he established a new colony, La Isabela, which became the first European settlement in the Americas. However, the colony struggled with food shortages, disease, and tensions between the Spanish settlers and the indigenous population. Columbus continued to explore the Caribbean, reaching islands such as Puerto Rico and Jamaica, while also enforcing Spanish rule over the local inhabitants. His insistence on extracting gold and labor from the Taino people led to harsh treatment and resistance, further escalating violence. As conditions worsened, many settlers grew dissatisfied with Columbus's leadership, and reports of his mismanagement began reaching Spain. By the time the voyage ended in 1496, La Isabela was failing, and Columbus's reputation was beginning to suffer. Despite these difficulties, his second voyage marked the true beginning of European colonization in the Americas, setting the stage for future Spanish expansion and conquest. From his first encounters with the indigenous Taino people in 1492, Christopher Columbus viewed them as potential laborers for the Spanish crown. During his second voyage, he implemented a system of forced labor, demanding that the natives provide gold and other resources. Those who failed to meet the Spanish quotas were often subjected to brutal punishments, including mutilation and execution. Columbus also initiated the practice of capturing and transporting indigenous people to Spain as slaves, sending shiploads of Taino men, women, and children across the Atlantic. Many perished during the journey due to harsh conditions, disease, and mistreatment. In the Caribbean, Spanish settlers continued enslaving the local population, using them for mining, agriculture, and construction. This exploitation, combined with European diseases and violent resistance, led to a dramatic decline in the indigenous population. By the early 1500s, the Spanish began importing enslaved Africans to replace the dwindling native workforce, marking the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Columbus's policies of enslavement set a precedent for European colonial practices in the New World, leaving a lasting and devastating impact on indigenous societies. In 1498, Christopher Columbus embarked on his third voyage to the New World, determined to find new territories and prove that the lands he had discovered were part of Asia. He set sail with 6 ships, splitting his fleet along the journey. While some ships carried supplies directly to Hispaniola, Columbus and a smaller crew took a more southerly route, reaching the coast of present-day South America. He became the first European to set eyes on the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela, realizing that this was part of a vast landmass, though he still believed it was connected to Asia. After exploring the region, Columbus sailed back to Hispaniola, where he found growing unrest among the Spanish settlers. Many were frustrated by the lack of wealth and his strict leadership, leading to open rebellion. Reports of his harsh rule and the colony's struggles reached Spain, prompting King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to send Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. In 1500, Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola, arrested Columbus, and sent him back to Spain in chains. Although he was eventually freed and allowed to continue his explorations, his reputation had been severely damaged, and his authority over the New World was never fully restored. In 1502, Christopher Columbus set sail on his fourth and final voyage, determined to find a passage to Asia and restore his reputation after his arrest and disgrace following his third expedition. He commanded 4 ships and a crew of around 150 men, avoiding Hispaniola on direct orders from the Spanish crown due to previous conflicts. Columbus explored parts of Central America, including present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, searching for a strait that would lead to the Indian Ocean. Along the way, he encountered hostile indigenous groups and faced severe storms that damaged his fleet. In 1503, after failing to find a passage and losing 2 ships, Columbus was forced to beach his remaining vessels on the coast of Jamaica. Stranded for over a year, he and his crew survived through uneasy relations with the local Taino people, who eventually refused to provide food. To regain control, Columbus famously used his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse to frighten the natives into continuing to support him. Finally, in 1504, a rescue ship arrived from Hispaniola, bringing Columbus and his men back to Spain. Though he returned alive, he was in poor health and largely ignored by the Spanish court. His 4th voyage had failed to achieve its objectives, and Columbus spent his final years in relative obscurity, still convinced that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. The Columbian Exchange refers to the widespread transfer of plants, animals, people, diseases, and cultures between the Old World and the New World, following Christopher Columbus's voyages. Europeans introduced crops such as wheat, rice, sugarcane, and coffee to the Americas, while receiving maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco in return. Livestock, including horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep, were brought to the New World, dramatically transforming indigenous ways of life, especially in agriculture and transportation. However, the exchange also had devastating consequences. European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly among indigenous populations who had no immunity, leading to massive depopulation. Some estimates suggest that up to 90% of the native population perished within a century of first contact. The Columbian Exchange also facilitated the transatlantic slave trade, as European powers sought labor to replace the indigenous workforce, decimated by disease and forced labor. While the exchange led to economic and agricultural growth in many parts of the world, it also contributed to the long-term exploitation and suffering of indigenous and African populations, reshaping global history in profound and irreversible ways. The voyages of Christopher Columbus marked the beginning of European colonization in the Americas, as Spain and other European powers sought to expand their influence, wealth, and control over newly discovered lands. Following Columbus's expeditions, Spain quickly established colonies in the Caribbean, exploiting indigenous labor and resources to build a vast empire. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca civilizations in the early 16th century further fueled European expansion, as gold and silver from the New World enriched Spain and encouraged other nations, including Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands, to establish their own colonies. Colonization led to the forced conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity, the introduction of European political and economic systems, and the large-scale destruction of native cultures and societies. The European demand for labor, especially in plantation agriculture, contributed to the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, bringing millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Over time, European colonies grew into powerful settlements, laying the foundations for the modern nations of North and South America, while leaving a legacy of exploitation, resistance, and cultural exchange that shaped the world's history. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas led to a catastrophic decline in indigenous populations due to a combination of disease, warfare, forced labor, and social disruption. European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly among native communities, who had no immunity, leading to death rates as high as 90% in some areas. Epidemics often wiped out entire villages before direct contact with Europeans even occurred. Warfare and violent conquests further reduced indigenous numbers, as European powers and settlers fought against native resistance, often using superior weaponry. Additionally, systems like the encomienda in Spanish colonies forced indigenous people into brutal labor conditions in mines and plantations, leading to exhaustion, malnutrition, and further loss of life. The destruction of traditional ways of life, displacement from ancestral lands, and cultural suppression contributed to the long-term decline of many indigenous civilizations. While some groups survived and adapted, the demographic collapse caused by European colonization permanently altered the social and political landscape of the Americas. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 between Spain and Portugal, was an agreement that divided newly discovered lands outside Europe between the two powers to prevent conflict over territorial claims. The treaty established an imaginary line approximately 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, with lands to the west belonging to Spain and lands to the east belonging to Portugal. This division, sanctioned by Pope Alexander VI, was meant to resolve disputes arising from Columbus's discoveries. While Spain gained most of the Americas, Portugal retained control over its African trade routes and later claimed Brazil, which fell east of the treaty's boundary. The agreement largely ignored the rights of indigenous peoples and failed to prevent competition from other European nations, such as England, France, and the Netherlands, who later challenged Iberian dominance in the New World. The treaty shaped the colonial boundaries of Latin America, influencing the linguistic and cultural differences between Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking regions that persist today. The transatlantic slave trade emerged as a direct consequence of European colonization in the Americas, as European powers sought a labor force to sustain their growing economies. With the rapid decline of indigenous populations due to disease and exploitation, European settlers turned to Africa, forcibly transporting millions of enslaved people across the Atlantic to work on plantations and in mines. The trade followed a triangular route. European merchants transported manufactured goods to Africa, where they exchanged them for captives. The enslaved were then shipped across the Atlantic in brutal conditions during the Middle Passage, and the final leg of the journey saw raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton transported back to Europe. Enslaved Africans faced inhumane treatment, forced labor, and extreme violence, with their cultural identities stripped away through systemic oppression. The transatlantic slave trade fueled European economic growth while devastating African societies, leading to long-term demographic, social, and economic consequences. Slavery became deeply entrenched in the Americas, particularly in regions like the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States, shaping racial hierarchies and social inequalities that persisted long after the trade was officially abolished in the 19th century. Christopher Columbus died on May 20, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain, at the age of 54. By the time of his death, his reputation had declined significantly. Once celebrated as the discoverer of new lands, he had lost much of his influence due to accusations of mismanagement and cruelty during his time as governor of Hispaniola. His later years were marked by illness, possibly arthritis or Reiter's syndrome, and he remained convinced that he had reached islands near Asia, rather than a new continent. Despite his diminished status, he continued to petition the Spanish crown for the wealth and titles he believed were owed to him under his original agreement with Ferdinand and Isabella. He died largely ignored by the court, though his voyages had already set in motion the European colonization of the Americas. Over time, his legacy became more complex, with some viewing him as a brave explorer, and others as a symbol of conquest and destruction. His remains were moved multiple times, with claims that they now rest in either Seville, Spain, or Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Christopher Columbus's legacy remains one of the most debated topics in history, as perspectives on his impact have shifted over time. For centuries, he was celebrated as a bold explorer who discovered the New World, paving the way for European expansion and global trade. His voyages were seen as a turning point in history, leading to the rise of powerful colonial empires and the spread of Western civilization. However, in modern times, Columbus has also been criticized for his role in initiating the colonization, enslavement, and mistreatment of indigenous peoples. His governance in the Caribbean was marked by brutality, forced labor, and violent suppression of native resistance. Many historians argue that his actions contributed to the devastating decline of indigenous populations due to disease, exploitation, and war. As a result, debates over Columbus's legacy have intensified, leading to calls for the removal of statues, renaming of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day in parts of the United States, and broader discussions about the consequences of European colonization. While some continue to honor him as a pioneering navigator, others see him as a symbol of oppression, making his legacy a complex and controversial subject in contemporary discourse.